Education, UPIS, he has taught at the kinder, elementary, secondary, undergraduate, and the graduate levels. After deciding to leave and learn outside the university, took the board licensure exam for teachers in March of 2018 and ranked first. For the past 9 years, he has been training teachers around the country with different organizations, most of which are projects with the Department of Education on reading and literacy, storytelling, gender equality education, children's literature. Currently, he is a teacher and assistant director of CHMCDC and is the technical training consultant for RPI International. Like most of you, he is still finishing his modules for his elementary students and is trying not to panic. He loves chocolate chip cookies, spaghetti, and sports. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. John Michael T. De La Paz.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Miss Michelle, for that introduction. And well, I'm happy to be here today. And I just want to show you, I just want to pull out my slide as I begin my talk. Here you go. Well, I'm excited to talk about vocabulary deficit and correction and remediation because this is a topic that's very important in all literacy classrooms, may it be from the kindergarten level to high school. So I just wanna go through that, some of the things I do 'no, para naman hindi niyo ano, para kilala niyo naman ako kahit papaano. Ayan, again, I'm currently finishing a project with, ABC Plus project with the Department of Education and RTI International. I'm beginning with this simply because I have been working with public school teachers the past 2 months, and I've been learning a lot from them, as I have been learning from them in the past 9 years that I have been training. But most importantly, I am a classroom and reading teacher. So everything that I'll be discussing is also based on experience as a classroom and reading teacher. Nilagay ko na rin yung picture ko para naman may puso, di ba? Kanya-kanyang pusoan na lang ito. Just kidding. Ayan. Okay. To facilitate our objectives or our goals for this afternoon, I only have an hour to talk to you about vocabulary deficit. But I want to start with the mindset, okay? With the mindset and to answer notions that we have in language learning in the Philippines that are hindering us from actually developing the vocabulary of our children. Then, two, we will be working with vocabulary within literacy, where we shall be looking at the vocabulary as in the bigger picture of reading and literacy. On the third goal, we shall be looking at teaching vocabulary and vocabulary deficit. Why is it important? Why do we have to address it? And why does it happen? And lastly, which will be the bulk of this talk, is the strategies for vocabulary deficit. How do we address vocabulary deficit? Yeah. Okay. So let me begin with the mindset. I want to always contextualize every talk that I give simply because we don't want to talk about literacy without that proper context, without having an idea of what it's all about or why is it important to talk about. So, more than just a gap in words, vocabulary deficit is actually a gap in society. Let me begin with this. I know a lot of you have seen this report, especially in Facebook, I guess, a couple of years back or a year ago. Ang dami nagpanic, ang dami nagalit, di ba? We have a poor educational system now, and we have a lot of problems, and that's true. Well, the Department of Education is really doing its best to really support our learners. There are so many challenges that they have to face, and we have to face as teachers, and also in this online setup, parents who are helping teachers. So if you look at this, the Philippines in reading ranked pretty low, if not last, second to the last. And I just wanted to highlight China, Singapore, and Finland, who were in the top of the test, the program for international student assessment. I want to also note that this is the first time the Philippines joined this, and so we don't have a benchmark, we don't have a prior record to this. So this is new data. Now, Philippines ranked really bad. Now, I just want to relate that to mathematics and science because if you notice, it's a similar trend. The performance in reading and mathematics and science are all interrelated and even connected, and we'll figure out in a bit why. Now let's compare our country to Southeast Asia. Again, in reading, since we're dead last, we have Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia ranking a little bit higher than us. For mathematics is the same, and for science as well. And I'm sure you're already seeing the trend here. Why I'm beginning with this one. Now let's look at Southeast Asia from the top. So this is how it looks like. Now look at the patterns of reading, mathematics, and science. There you go, right? If you notice, in a way, your your capacity, your ability in reading really affects the content areas. And this is why this data that we have now from 2018 is something that can help us guide our programs, our reading, literature, and literacy design in teaching our children. So bakit 'to nangyayari? Okay. Now I have here some ideas. I want to start with this idea. Why does this affect that data? Why is that data like that? One idea is this. I want to call it, marunong ka ba mag-English? In the Philippines, kunyari, what do you want to put in your pizza? A bell pepper. People would laugh at it, probably would judge that person. Okay, what do you need for frying? I need oil para magpreto. Diba? Or now that it's a pandemic, how do you go from your home to your work? Sumasakay ako ng bicycle. Right? And when you hear this from fellow Filipinos, there's that judgment, automatic judgment. Filipinos are harsher towards their fellow Filipinos than we are to other foreigners, right? Or other nationals. So may judgment na kaagad yan without actually knowing why this happens. Okay. But on the other hand, if you have a foreigner like a K-pop, if you're a K-pop fan or someone from abroad comes here, tapos, mahal ko po kayo. Wow, ang cute-cute niya, nakakakilig. Diba? Pero and then, when you have a friend, probably say, Kuya, can you drop me off doon? And like, meron kagad notions about mas social sila, mas mayaman sila. So, without even going to language itself yet, there are these notions that's already affecting language. And we cannot, and we should not disregard these things. Kasama na rin yan, kadugtong na rin yan as English only please, diba? When I just titled it that way because ang dami na nating naririnig ng mga ganitong notions. So, meron tayong mga, nosebleed kapag nag-English yung narinig mong kausap mo, konyo, minsan yung konyo na i-equate na siya to being Englishero kahit hindi naman dapat. Tapos you have that mga concepts ng jologs kasi alam mo yung tono ng isang tao from the province or from the. So there are so many notions affecting how we view language learning even before we go explicitly to how we should teach them. And just to go back to my previous slide, yan, for instance, yung bell pepper na yan, oh well, para magpreto, sumakay ako ng vehicle. There's reason to that. For instance, not for instance, to explain. We have this map, right? There's so many languages in the country. There are 170 plus. A few years back, two of those languages died because nobody's a living person who can still teach that language. So marami talaga languages in Philippines. And thus, most Filipino children are multilingual. And a lot of us forget this. You have your mother tongue, you have an L1 or Filipino, and then you have your L2 or your English. And sometimes, if not all the time, madalas yung mother tongue na yan, meron pa yung mga dialects, different variations for different places. And the child is exposed to that. I just want to note that English is the medium of teaching and learning, or the MOTL, in the upper grades. And that's why this is very important to talk about. Now, why am I starting with this? A lot of Filipinos outside Manila, say outside Manila is the majority of Filipino children, right? They already have multiple languages. But because of our preconceived notions that English is the only way to go, English is the best language, English is something that would, iaahon ka sa kahirapan, di ba? These are all real. These are all realities, and it's very important to address this. Now, English is important because it gives us an advantage when we work or when we're looking for a job. But English, if we're just talking plainly about languages, English is equal to Filipino, it's equal to mother tongue. When Filipinos are asked how many languages can you speak, usually they would say two, Filipino English. They forget that they can actually also speak the mother tongue. And you know why? Because we have that preconceived notions that English is the only language that's worthy to study. And because of this, because you have a mother tongue, you have that Filipino, you have to understand that our orthography, even our system of speaking, is different from Filipino and English if you have a mother tongue. Kaya nga minsan, if I will be going back, yeah, allow me to go back to my previous slide. Yung bell paper na yan, the reason that's like that is because in that language, if it's Bisaya or whatnot, wala sila, yung vowels nila, hindi pareho sa vowels ng English. Remember, vowels of English have a lot of sounds. Unlike in Filipino and most of Philippine languages, the a, e, I, o, u, they only have one sound for each. And in this case, yung bell paper, yung nila, hindi nila yan, yung e nila, most of the time, it's like a long e. Kaya hindi, wala sila ng e na short. Kaya hindi nahihirapan sila magsalita ng bell pepper. And this is something that this is a study, this is already an old study, and it's also Western, so I have to admit that, but it helps us understand. So si Betty Hart and Todd Risley in their book Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experiences, they found out that at 3 years old, if you're from a high in 5 million words by the time that you're 3. But if you're from a low-income family or a welfare family, you only have around 13 million words. So if you look at the disparity, it's very big. And hindi natin to pwedeng ikaila kasi nangyayari rin to sa Pilipinas. And I'm sure there are studies with this. My apologies, I just wasn't able to look at them and or include them, I mean. Yeah. So this is a real gap. And unless we start from this, our addressing of vocabulary deficit might be a bit superficial because there is a basis to that deficit. If we keep teaching languages detached and gap in their Filipino, considering that they are situated in the Philippines and they are expected to learn Filipino. On the other hand, for public schools, a lot of them have that big gap in English. And that's something that we have to understand. But for us to understand that, we must tap onto these things. Bakit ba tayo makikipag-usap? Bakit ba natin kailangan matuto ng English? Because we want to also empathize, to understand what each group of people is going through or experiencing. So we're not detached. Hindi tayo kanya-kanya because kanya-kanya mentality is very strong among Filipinos. Now, I know is this off topic? I would argue it's not. Because when we think individually, when we think without a context, when we think without these things at hand, then we might have a weak vocabulary deficit strategies might be weak when we try to address that vocabulary deficit. So remember, teachers, all throughout this talk, this is our main goal. We want to teach literacy to be understood, to understand, to empathize, and to also communicate. And I'm sure a lot of you know we kind of lack empathy nowadays. Okay, so let's go now to vocabulary within literacy. So I already gave you the idea. Why do we have to learn these things? And yeah. So, but before I do this, no, I just want to ask if, and I think we have our facilitators here. If you're on YouTube and you're watching, can I just maybe ask you if you agree? Just give me agree with what I said earlier, or if you disagree, I just would really want to know. Ayan. So maybe Ma Michelle or Miss Sandy can just update me in a bit kung kamusta yan. So did you agree or do you agree with the things that I said or I started with? Yeah. So before I go to the vocabulary within literacy. Okay? Yeah. So I talked about language use. Two things we have to differentiate. Yeah. First, language use, whenever we teach it, it must be very explicit that we should understand there's a receptive language use and there's an expressive language use. Okay. For instance, when we are listening right now, you're listening to what I'm saying. Sadly, this is a live webinar, so I can't really converse with you. I would love that. Kaya lang kulang yung time at hindi ganun yung platform natin. So you're using ganun rin when you're reading, right? You're processing whatever you read that, as well as viewing as part of the macro skills, viewing of film, kung ano man yan, TV series, moments of literacy, and the most essential reading components. So I'm sure if you're a reading teacher, you should know this by heart. You have your oral language. It starts at K to 3, from 4 to, and moves to 4 to 6 up to 11 and 12. Oral language is always a part of our teaching and our instruction when we are language teachers. Then you have your phonological awareness. Remember phonological awareness? This has to do with sounds. That's why you start with sound names, sounds, so rhymes, alliterations. You have yung onsets or beginning sounds, and then you have your rhymes or the ending part of the sound, the word. Rhymes as in RIMES. And then of course you have your rhyming words. Rhyming words because those things they expose children to sounds, right? Then you have book and print knowledge. This is one way of knowing if your child is ready to learn how to read. If he or she knows where is the front of the book or where's the back portion of the book. Also, kasama rin dito yung side sweep na tinatawag. Di ba? When we read in the Philippines, or if you're using English or Filipino, or even mother tongue, we move from left to right and then from top going to the next line. So bottom ka. So return sweep, left to right, and then you return sweep, go down the line, then left to right again. So kasama yan. So that happens in K to 3. So dapat K to 3 pa lang exposed na sila dyan. Hindi na yan dapat tinuturo sa 4 to 6. Alphabet knowledge, this is where they learn about alphabets, the names of the alphabets, the sounds of the alphabets, which is connected to phonics and word recognition. That should be happening in K to 3, meaning they should, by this time, phonics and word recognition, they understand the connection of sounds to the written symbol or to print. So yan, kailangan nilang maintindihan yan. And then you have your fluency. Okay, so fluency, this already involves the accuracy of how they use words, how they write, how they speak, how they listen. Yeah. Kasama yan in the use of vocabulary as well. And then you have spelling. Yeah, spelling K to 3 to 4 to 6. Then you have writing and composition. So I don't have much time to talk about all of these things. But if you notice, writing and composition, grammar awareness and structure, they happen from K up until grade 12. And then you have vocabulary development. Now, you would ask, teacher, bakit wala na po? Teacher JM, teacher Mike, why is it that wala na siya sa 11 to 12? Because it's not really saying na wala na siyang vocabulary development sa 11 to 12. But remember, by 11 and 12, this is already like college, di ba? Nung nag-adjust tayo ng system. They should already have enough vocabulary to process whatever it is they want to specialize in as an undergraduate or going to college. Okay, so ang priority natin, K to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 10, enough na yung vocabulary nila. They have millions of words to use to be able to, also in an expressive way. And then the rest are reading comprehension. You have listening comprehension, attitude towards language, ayan, literacy and literature, and study strategies. And that's why I also just started with that attitude towards language, literacy, and literature, because that attitude will really help our vocabulary development, and especially when we are trying to address that deficit. Okay, because if you have a bad attitude or a negative attitude towards language learning, specifically towards English or Filipino, if you're not really good at Filipino, then attitude is really very important. Yeah. Okay. So, 5 components of reading. Daan na lang natin mabilis. You have your reading. If you want to use this framework, you have reading comprehension, fluency, like I said, phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary. And if you notice, vocabulary is part of that. So part siya ng domains of literacy, part din siya ng 5 components of reading. So if you're going to create a design, a reading class design, then these things are very important. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on. So now, teaching vocabulary and vocabulary deficit. Now, what is this all about? First, sinabi ko ulit, language and use, no? Receptive and expressive, you already know that. So I just wanted to review that. But also, we want to make sure that it's more than word definitions. A lot of Filipinos, so not just Filipinos, a lot of teachers, especially if you're new in teaching, or parents who are now teaching their kids in this pandemic, when you say vocabulary, una mo na kaagad naisip is word definitions. May word bank si teacher, maybe sa likod ng notebook, may papalist ng word bank. Usually, bago magsimula ang kwento, meron ding word bank. Yes, that's part of vocabulary, but it goes beyond that. So you have to understand that it's not just pat is a cat or may mais si mama. Okay, vocabulary is how to. These things include find the meanings of unknown words and phrases, interpret literal versus non-literal language, diba? Sa literal and non-literal language, sometimes literal sinasabi, pero hindi naman pala yun yung meaning niya, kaya ang daming misunderstandings, right? You also have to understand shades of word meanings in a certain context. It will also help you. Vocabulary also is knowing how to create better reading comprehension. Of course, if you have more words in your mind, then you'll have more chances of understanding a text. And of course, improving the ability to engage, to produce, and to talk about texts. If you're a teacher in grades 4 to 6 in high school, this is very important because by that time you want to start, you should be able to encourage your children to use their vocabulary to talk about texts. At hindi lang to sa English or sa Filipino. To talk about text beyond those two, science, diba, math. Yan. So if they don't have the vocabulary to do that, they would really have a hard time or they would struggle. Halimbawa, 'di ba, when we talk about reading, we always want to talk about feelings, 'di ba? Or we want to go to higher order thinking skills. And sorry, yeah. One higher order thinking skills. Sorry, let me just fix that. Yeah. One higher order thinking skill is, inferencing. And when you ask a student after, reading a book or perhaps viewing a film or even just talking about something, then you can ask that kid, what are you feeling? And I don't know if you experience this as a grade school teacher or even as a high school teacher sa English or sa Filipino, ang pagpipilian lang nila, teacher sad, teacher happy. Okay? And it's very limited. It's very limited because they might not have the vocabulary to express feelings. Kaya kinder pa lang, dapat alam na nila yan. Alam na nila yung plethora, yung spectrum of feelings, and they should be able to talk about that. Because by the time they go to grade school and high school, they should be able to identify feelings when they're reading a text. They should be able to identify their own feelings towards the text that they are reading. Yan. Ito pa, did you like the film or did you like the book? O kunyari, pinag-uusapan nyo yung No Limit Angel or Filibusterismo or you're doing a Shakespeare class. Did you like the book? What can you say about it? Why? Ang madalas na sagot, teacher, nakaka-relate po ako. Okay? And teacher, nakaka-relate po ako. Technically, it's not really a bad answer. It means the child or the student has found something that connects his life or her life to the text. But this is very simple. At high school, you should not be hearing this anymore. Dapat pag sinabi nila, pag sa mind nila, you know what, nakaka-relate ako sa kwento na ito, they should already be equipped by the necessary vocabulary to express how to express that idea that you are able to have that connection. Nakaka-relate ka nga talaga. Ba? So hindi pwedeng ito lang yung yung catchphrase mo or yung safe words mo whenever you're discussing literature. Right? And so, vocabulary deficit and word gap is very crucial because it's simply put, okay? I just wanted to focus on this. You don't have enough words in the bank. You don't have enough vocabulary in your mind to be able to progress in your reading and your literacy. In 1983, matagal na to, ni Jean Shaw, it's the fourth grade slump. And it's also true for our setting in the Philippines. Madalas, pag hindi nagbabasa ang estudyante, by fourth grade, it's really going to be a very hard, difficult road for that starting fourth grade. Kaya dapat, if you notice in domains of literacy, you should be able to address those already. Otherwise, yung fourth grade slump na yan, dito na lang sisimula, di ba? Lalo na if you're working in a public school, mahirap kasi talaga mag-retain ng estudyante kahit you know na hindi pa siya ready. Minsan napapasa na lang natin for mass promotion. Those are realities. So, therefore, we have to make sure we work on this together. If you're in a school, fourth grade slump, bago pa sila dumating ng fourth grade, na-identify nyo na sino yung mga nahihirapan. Now, take note, teachers, that vocabulary deficit, even if we're talking primarily about English, it also happens in Filipino. And I don't know if you would agree, but a lot of private schools have difficulty in Filipino. By the time na nasa high school sila, mostly English lang talaga alam nilang words. So yung bilingualism nila, yes, they're still bilingual, but it's limited on that language, Filipino. Kaya nga pagdating ng high school, hirap na rin sila if you're gonna talk about the novels that we have to read, like Nolimi or Helfili. Again, limited na naman yung words na pwede nilang express. And they resort to using English. And ganoon rin naman sa Filipino, when we don't address the deficit, then by the time they go to high school, they would really struggle. And it's almost game over kasi ang hirap na yun i-undo. But it's still possible. Mas mahirap lang talaga. And that's where remediation and correction will happen. Or need to happen. Now, vocabulary deficit and word gap, they both affect progress in school, but also the enjoyment of school. Papansin nyo yan, kung kinder, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 pa lang, hirap na sila. They got embarrassed kasi hindi sila makapagbasa, napagalitan pa sila about it. Everybody's reading pero sila hindi. Nahihiya sila. And they won't enjoy school as much as they want to. And sometimes, not all the time, this can also be the start of misbehavior. Diba? Ang hirap makinig sa teacher, sa isang lesson, kung hindi ko naman naiintindihan yung sinasabi ni teacher. So that's very important to remember. And lastly, vocabulary is intrinsically linked to academic success. The more words you have, the more words you have in your bank, or the more vocabulary you have, then more chances of winning, diba? More chances to succeed academically, right? Now, speaking of teaching vocabulary, you have to understand these two things. Teaching vocabulary happens in two ways. First is incidental, and second is intentional. Okay. Why are we going through this? Because incidental, minsan iniisip natin intentional na vocabulary na yun, pero hindi naman pala. Like when you unlock words before a story, that is just incidental. We're not really, you can make it a little bit more intentional if it's a one-on-one or a small group, pero most of the time, it's incidental. You're just unlocking the words because we're going to use it for that text. And sometimes, or most of the time, if you don't use those words, makakalimutan na nila yun. Okay, so it's more mostly incidental. Now, translating words in a conversation, I know if yun nga, pag nahihirapan na, again, either it's Filipino or in English, dahil kulang na nga yung vocabulary, dahil malaki na yung deficit and yung gap, they resort to translating. It's incidental because it's not systematic. Ang mangyayari, if they don't understand the word, you translate it to a comfortable language. Okay, and then exposure to literature is also incidental. It's important to read stories to children. It's important to expose them to rhymes, to riddles, to songs, even in high school and even in grade school. They are exposed to literature, and this is still incidental. In fact, in terms of language development, because a lot of our children or a lot of our students, well, I'm sorry, I'm talking about those who have the privilege to have a computer or an internet at home, kahit Mobile Legends yan, that you can still consider it as part of exposure to literature. So marami silang words na nakikita, marami silang words na nalalaman. Like, kunyari, kung naglalaro ka ng Mobile Legends, for instance, mga grade 1 mo pa lang, grade 2, alam nila, nagbaban sila, nakaban po, o kaya they have their own vocabulary for each game, or Roblox, or Minecraft, right? Or even outside that, even if you don't have internet connection, or if you don't have those resources, meron pa rin silang exposure to games, for example. Diba? Nanay, tatay, gusto kong tinapay. Those are already exposing children to vocabulary. But all of these are just incidental. Okay? If you want to remediate and correct vocabulary, you have to shift your focus from incidental to intentional. Take note, you cannot forget about the incidental, but you have to give more priority to intentional teaching of vocabulary, and that includes word studies, use of strategies, and what other people call word attack. So atakihin mo. Pag naka-encounter ka ng isang word na unknown, how do you attack it, or what do you do while you encounter it? And so, let me introduce you with this three. Okay, I grouped them into three blocks of strategies. The first block, which I got from P. Maniak et al. In 2014, first you have to have a good routine of introducing words. But part to ng intentional, but also incidental. Ginagamit rin natin to whenever we start a story, before we read a story, before we have a listening comprehension or a film viewing even. So these are the steps. First, you have to use that word in context. So mag-introduce ka ng word, di ba? Second, it should be kid-friendly. When I say kid-friendly, it should be student-friendly or age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate to the children you're teaching. May it be in kinder or high school. Number three, you have to use give multiple examples of use of the word. Okay, importante yan. So let's start with that. Yan, student use pala, yan. Then number four, student use, sorry for that error. And then 5, you have your visual image. 6, you can also extend the conversation by having a thought question or a quick interactive activity. So let me give you an example of picturesque. I don't know if this sounds familiar these days. I'm sure if you're in social media, may mga nabalitaan tayo. And instead of making fun of them, let's understand how we can improve that. Okay, if you're going to unlock picturesque, or that's your target word. So you want to give it a context. You want to use it in a context. When I visited Bicol for the first time, I was amazed by the picturesque Mount Mayon. It was beautiful. So if you notice your children, if they're already exposed to context clues, then you should be able to ask them. Okay, there are clues here. It was beautiful. I was amazed. Okay, and also ano yung gamit niya dun sa word, sa sentence, these things for a student with good vocabulary, word attack skills would be able to decipher. If not, then you have to address those. Okay. So yeah, you can also use another sentence. Later, I climbed a hill and saw a picturesque view of the Bicol region. I took so many photos of the view. And then two, you go for a student or an age appropriate definition, right? It may be like something like this. So you give them that part of speech. Is it an adjective, a verb, a noun? And then you give them simple definitions that they would understand. Okay, even in high school. Of course, not as simple as you would give a kinder student, but simple pa rin. Kasi you don't want them to be unlocking the definition because the definition is supposed to help them unlock the target word, which in this case is picturesque. I just want to note at this point that early grades versus upper grades use different forms of definitions. If you're teaching kinder to grade 3, most of the time, or even grade 4, 5, you want to give a definition that is exactly the same, uses the same tense, verb tense, and structure as it will be used later on at the text, in the text that you will be using. Okay, so meaning kung past tense yung, kunyari verb, past tense yung gagamitin niya sa text, then for the early grades, don't use the infinitive. It's better to use a synonym or a similar word that's also in the past tense. Okay, so that's very important. But for the upper grades, starting maybe around grade 4 to high school, they should already be able to use the infinitive. Okay? Or yung ito kasi yung mga nasa dictionary, if you're talking about verbs, di ba? When you say, um, if you're defining a verb, usually it has two blank. Okay? What does cook mean? To put ingredients together and sometimes use heat to combine them. Ganyan. Okay? So, remember, for the early grades, iba yung pagde-define tsaka yung upper grades. Nonetheless, it should be a student-friendly or an age-appropriate definition. Then, step number 3, you can give multiple examples of that, how it's used, especially if the word has a lot of uses. Okay? Kung iba-iba sila ng gamit. Kasi minsan, there's a tendency for the child to just base the definition of that word based on how you used it. Kung isang sentence lang yung binigay mo, may isip niya na yun lang yung gamit ng word, which is not going to be effective. Then, of course, student use. We always do this. Diba? Does anybody want to use the word in a sentence? Or sometimes the teacher will give a sentence with a blank, and then the students will have to tell which target word shall fit that blank. And then you can also give a visual image, like picturesque. So when I went to Bicol, I took this picture. It's a picturesque view, or it's a picturesque landscape. So it's a visual image. So to drive the point of what that is, lalo na if it's an adjective. And then you can go and try a thought question or an interactive activity. For instance, what picturesque things have you seen, or landscapes or sceneries or views have you seen? Okay, yan. So it's very simple. Okay, so just to review, you have words in context, you have a kid-friendly or an age-appropriate definition, you have multiple examples of use, student use, or give the chance to your students to use them, include a visual image, and lastly, if there's time, a thought question and an interactive activity must be done to further, you know, uh, allow the children to use the vocabulary. Remember, hindi po yan like 2 times na nagamit, alam na nila. I'm sure you know that they have to use it several times. Now, some things that you have to understand, because this good routine of introducing words is important when you're trying to remediate and correct. Okay? You have to make sure as a teacher that you don't have a difficult time with this flow, meaning you practice it all the time. Kasi kapag hindi mo memorize, lagi kang kunyari nakatingin ka sa lesson plan mo tapos nalilito ka pa, then even that might not be fluid, sayang yung oras mo. Like imagine, you have to consider time. If you're going to introduce 7 words, sometimes if you follow that routine, it might take you up until 30 minutes. Okay? And that's not really, effective. Lalo na kung nasa classroom tayo na by subjects. Lilipat ka pa ng next subject mo, diba? Or next class. So you have to practice pacing. But teachers, if you're introducing words, new words, especially before a story or before a text to be encountered, you have to prioritize efficiency. Meaning, kung pwedeng i-let go yung ibang parts, if first wag yung context, wag yung definitions, kunyari yung interactive activities. If you don't have time for that, you can refine as you get familiar with the flow. Because what you want to do is efficiency. Sometimes when you're introducing a target word and then ang dami-dami mong pinagawa, like nagpatawag ka pa ng estudyante, ano kayang ibig, you want to know what the child thinks of the definition of the word. Yes, those strategies might help enrich the language experience, but for vocabulary, because we're talking about vocabulary deficit and gap, it might not be as efficient. Kasi ang dami nangyayari kasi na nakafocus sila sa words. So ideally, when you want to introduce words around 15 minutes, ideally tapos ka na. Kasi hindi niya ka dapat kainin yung buong time mo. Okay. So you can refine as you get familiar with the flow. Okay, that's that. So if you have questions, yeah, sorry if I'm talking really fast. Yeah, kasi para ma-cover natin yung mga strategies pa. Now, another group or chunk of strategies, which is the bulk of this talk, is responding to student confusion. A lot of remediation must be addressed towards that confusion. And thus, first you have to organize words. To respond to the confusion, organize words. Teachers, please remember this. Kung may isa lang kayong maaalala sa akin with vocabulary deficit, when faced with the unfamiliar, students need an anchor, meaning they need something to go back to, something to use. So that's what you want to provide them, especially for struggling readers or for students with a big vocab gap or a vocab deficit. How do you organize words? A lot of these you already know, and you might have been doing. So let's just refresh and word lists. So just 5. Let's go through them one at a time. Word list. Kinder ka pa lang. You go through these things already, di ba? After phonological awareness or while doing phonological awareness and then moving to phonics and word recognition. Once you move to phonics and word recognition, dito kasi meron na talagang writing na yun nga, yung connection na ng words sa mind mo to the printed text. Okay? So word lists are very important. Other word lists in the upper grades are also important. Silent letters. Silent letters in English is something uh, different from our Filipino language. We don't have silent letters. English has a lot of silent letters simply because the etymology of most of these words are from different languages as well. So minsan may mga nawawala na if it's from French, if it's from a Germanic language and the like. So yeah, word families, di ba? Sa kinder, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, we do this. And then suffix word list. Suffix or even, yeah, di ba? Sometimes when we have spelling lists, those are also examples of word lists. Let me check the time. There you go. So marami yan. Now, concept sorts. Concept sorts is similar to the list sorts later. But for now, concept sorts is a vocabulary and comprehension strategy wherein it's used to familiarize students with a new topic, or you also want to check ano na yung alam nila. Okay? So what you can do is you provide students with a list of terms or concepts from a reading material, and then you ask them to sort it out. Okay? So pwedeng open sorts, meaning pag open sorts, wala kang ibibigay na category. Sila yung iisip kung paano nila gugrupo yun. Okay? Kunyari, may binagay kang words like kunyari spaghetti, apple, lettuce, chips. Maybe some of them would group them according to healthy and unhealthy food, or maybe favorite foods and food that they don't like to eat. Okay, so that depends on what kind of sort you want to do. So again, open sort means there's no categories. The children will be the one, or the students will be the one to sort it out. Closed sorts meaning you provide the categories. Now, if you're teaching language and to also facilitate with the Yan, to facilitate with, grammar as well. You can, when you're teaching, when you're teaching nouns, for instance, you can start with nouns. Pwede mo, pag high school ka na, pwede mong concept sort sa kanila yung proper common, abstract concrete, maybe yung animals, places, people, objects, ideas, mass and count. Kasi alam na nila dapat yun. So you can start with those things. Okay? So in terms of vocabulary building though, then you can also sort them based on what words will be used for the book or the story or the text that is in hand. So yeah, and they want to try to sort these words about difficulty, money, empathy, vaccine. Yan. Paano nyo yan i-sort? Or even more words. Now, the difference of that from list group labels is in list group labels, it's also a form of semantic mapping. But for list group labels, you want students to be actively involved in the listing. So sila rin yung mag-iisip ng mga words that they want to categorize, to group, and to label. Okay, kaya siya list group labels. This encourages students to improve their vocabulary categorization. Vocabulary and categorization. So there's a a list of words, and then they have to categorize it, group and labels. It also helps students organize new concepts in relation to previously learned concepts. So they can show you how their mind works. So it's also a bit metacognitive as well. But for now, we're putting it into confusion para, again, we want them to organize these words. Lalo na if they already encountered it in a text that they already read. Right? Then you have your word dissect. Word dissect by Lens and Hughes in 1990. It's a word identification strategy. It's a mnemonic, so look at that. D for discover context. I isolate the prefix. S separate the suffix. S say the stem. Then E examine the stem and check with someone. And lastly, try the dictionary. That's why the use of dictionary is very important because by grades 4, 5, and 6, they should already know how to check. Now that we're online and we have technology, this use of dictionary might not be the same as the way we learned it when we were younger or when we're teaching it with an actual dictionary. It's still important to do that. But as language teachers in this day and age, you should also know how they will use definitions when they search it in Google, for instance. So kailangan alam pa rin nila parts of speech, the pronunciation, and the samples, and the like. So this is how you can use that. So word dissect. So sa remediation, or for struggling readers with the word deficit, you're giving them a way to approach or to attack a word so they can dissect it. Ano ba example? For example, notice that one. So inactivity. The word is inactivity. Just in case it's a new word to them, you start with the prefix. Okay, steps. There are steps, diba? Discover the context. You can give them a sample sentence, and then you can isolate the prefix or the prefix, and then isolate the suffix, and then identify the stem. Now, this is a more complicated strategy because there are steps to that. For example, when you're already in the stem part, which is, let me see, again, it's the say the stem, diba? So fourth stage or the fourth level. And then you go to examine it. When you examine it on the fifth step, then you have rules. For example, if the stem begins with a vowel, you want to separate those vowels, the first two letters. So yung active AC, separate recitative. Okay, but if it's a consonant, then start with three. Three yung pag-separate mo. So ACT, tas IV, just in case lang. That's an example. So it's very important because those rules of twos and threes might help them, lalo na if they're a struggling reader with limited vocabulary in the upper grades. So they can dissect the words and use that mnemonic. Okay, I can't really dwell on this too much because we don't have much time, but you can search this in the internet. There are a lot of strategies and samples and demos for this. Yeah. And then word cognates, one of my favorites. Word cognates. Diba, I started with saying that a lot of Filipino children are multilingual. So what are word cognates? Word cognates are words that have the same origin. Okay, so they probably are spelled. Sometimes they're spelled exactly the same. Sometimes they spelled slightly differently, but sound similar. Okay. So I'll give you first false cognates or cognates that seem to be cognates but are not. For example, diba, the in, where? I think this is in Hiligay noon. Or the in Filipino is to put pressure. They sound the same, pero they're not. So they're not cognates at all. They're false cognates or false friends. Tang tawag sa kanila, false cognates. Okay, if you're in Pampanga, if you're Kapampangan, ebon is egg. In Filipino or Tagalog, ibon is bird. So if you're traveling from Bulacan to Pampanga, mag-iiba na yung ibon, ebon. Okay? It's very different. So they're not cognates. There's also kamut, if I'm not mistaken, in Hiligaynon. Kamut is hand. Kamot is scratch or kamot. So they're also not cognates. So gamay, small, and I think this is also in Hiligaynon. And then gamay is highly familiar if you're in Filipino or Tagalog. So you have to be aware of this. Not because two words sound the same or similar in spelling, they're automatically cognates. These are not cognates. So what are samples of cognates? Halimbawa, you wanna bridge. This is also part of bridging. There's so many ways to bridge languages from your L1 or mother tongue to your target language. So if a student is struggling with their vocabulary, especially in English, then you can work with word cognates. Kunyari, doctor. Doctor is in English, right? You can tell them, okay, basahin nga natin ang salita sa Filipino, yung nasa kaliwa, and then on the right side is English. So doctor, doctor. And then the student can repeat it with you. If you know, then you make them identify differences. Ano napapansin mo? What do you notice? Doctor is in Filipino and doctor is in English. Let me use my annotate button. I can even encircle, right? So teacher, tingin ko po, sorry, let me change my ink. Teacher, iba po siya sa gitna. K. C po, ginagamit sa English. So these are word cognates that can help them see differences. And it's also bridging. You're already using things that they know in a more comfortable language, such as Filipino, and you just have to bring it and connect that to the English cognate. So it's not that hard. Kasama na rin dito syempre yung pronunciation, 'di ba? Doctor, doctor. Teacher, napansin ko rin po sa doctor, yung diin po niya nasa kabila, doctor, tama ba? Yeah. And then in English, it's doctor. In vocabulary, yun, pwede nyo rin i-notice yan. That's also a clue. Most of the English words for nouns, not all the time, but most of them, nouns have the stress on the first syllable. Okay? So yun ang sample. Then you can say lampara. Lampara in Filipino, lamp in English. O anong pinagkaiba nila? Sa lampara, yan. Nadagdagan, mas mahaba yung sa Filipino. Sa English, it's just lamp. Okay? Pero pareho sila sa lamp. Pareho sila dito sa lamp. Lampara, lamp. So almost same yung sound, nadagdagan lang, humaba lang yung word. So those are just examples. Okay? So those are word cognates. So don't be afraid to connect that. This is different from translating. Teachers, translating is like what I said earlier, it's incidental. In this way, by using cognates, it's more intentional because you're making them see differences. Kaya po importante when you have games, 'di ba, yung spot the differences. Those are not just for fun. Those are actually designed to help students read so they know they can decipher what's different from one to the other. Yeah. So we're running out of time. Yeah. Now, so those are strategies. Another one under responding to student confusion is to explicitly address wrong usages. Because you're trying to address the gap, you want to make sure that you lessen wrong usage. And in class, kaya kanina, if you notice, while I was telling you how to introduce words, as much as possible, avoid unnecessary or spending so much time asking for ideas from kids kung ano yung tingin nila or what they think the word means. Because if there's so many wrong usages na lumabas, it might spread. It might spread, it actually easily spreads. And you don't want that to happen. Again, we're in the part of responding to student confusion and we don't want to confuse them anymore. So explicitly address the wrong usage, or if not wrong, an incomplete usage. Sometimes when we define, isang aspect lang ng definition yung nakukuha nila. Okay. For example, in the word picturesque earlier, dahil dinefine natin siya, something beautiful to look at, pwedeng naisip lang ng bata, picturesque means maganda. So lahat na lang ginagamit niya yung picturesque when hindi na sakto yung definition. For example, meron siyang nakitang okay, for example, I made an activity sheet. I think the activity sheet is picturesque. Diba? It's not really an exact good accurate use of it. So medyo kulang. So it's not really wrong, but it's also not that accurate. Okay, and also if you see na may nakita kayo kunyari online na mali yung gamit ng picturesque, then now that you're talking about this, then you try to correct that wrong thing that you saw. Paano siya matatama para sa mga estudyante natin? And also for the students to know, if it's wrong, it's also feedback. So they know they won't, they would stop using it in the wrong way. Most of the time kasi pag mali nga yung gamit, ang nangyayari, walang nag-correct sa kanila, dadagdag lang siya sa gap kasi kulang or mali yung gamit. Now, the third block and also the last block I wanted to talk to you about. I would want to really talk about this, each of these in detail, katulad nung kanina, but my apologies, we don't have much time. I only have an hour, and you can read on these anyway. So for metacognition, we also want to improve how students think about their thinking process in dealing with words. So this would really help in your remediating vocabulary. So ano mga napili ko or common ones that are used, concept maps, checklists, and word choice of self-assessment, especially for upper grades. Let's go to concept maps. I'm sure you've used this like word mapping or semantic maps. Yeah. You have a term and then you want them to, you know, write down things that reminds them or that comes to their mind when they hear that word. Okay. Now, that's a pre-reading activity, for instance. And then after that, after reading, or even not just reading, after explicitly introducing the word, the steps I introduced earlier, then pagtapos nun, dapat mas complicated na. They can see more connections to different words. Okay? So in this way, you're not just allowing the child to see how his mind or her mind has improved from learning a word before discussing that word and then after learning that word and discussing that word. So makikita nila physically may manifestation na mas naging complicated. And this is not just for language learning. You can use it for science. For example, on day one, you talk to them about science. I do this when my science class in grade school. So grade 1 or grade 2, di ba? Ito yung concept map. What comes to your mind when you talk about science? When you think of science? Tapos after nan, gagawin ko ulit on the last day. And makikita mo, there are differences. Okay? But for vocabulary specifically, you would want them to connect certain words that are similar. Words do I know? What can I define? What words have I seen or heard? And also, what words do I not know? Okay, so iba-iba yan. Sometimes you've been exposed to it, like usually in incidental language experiences, but you really don't understand what it is. So you can just list it down there. I have seen but not heard. And then maybe naman meron ring mga words na hindi mo talaga alam, right? And you want to learn these words. Okay? So that's a checklist for you. Yeah. I have 3 minutes left. Okay, and lastly, this is also my favorite. This is not just for high school or upper grades. You can also use this in a simpler way for the early grades. When you want them to talk about, kunyari nga, di ba, emotions o kaya words that describe, you can ask them this sentence. I use the word blank here to mean blank. So they're more aware of what they wanted to mean or what was their, what's in their minds when they chose that word. And then you can change that. If I had used a synonym for that word chosen instead of the actual word chosen, then the meaning or the effect would have been different because, but so ano mo sa pinaka-sample, di ba? If you say someone is, my students in grade 3 and grade 4 would laugh. For example, you want to talk about crushes. Sabi mo sa crush mo, you wrote that crush a letter, you're cute. And then another person probably, what if another person writes, you're gorgeous or you're beautiful? And di ba, iba na, kulang na yung cute. Do you really, di ba? I mean, we're just talking about a quick example. There are better examples, but the word cute and gorgeous and beautiful are at different levels. So they have to know if that's the word that they're going to use. They have to know that it might change its meaning or the impact or the effect when you change that word or if you think of a synonym. Okay, so that's word choice self-assessment. So there are many ways to do that. Okay, you can look it up in the internet and even in books and literacy. So in essence, yan, I gave you concept source, list group labels, word cognates, word dissect, checklists, word choice self-assessment, concept maps. And then there's also, make sure, good routine intro of target words. You want to respond to students' confusion. And you want to also tap on metacognition. There's so many ways to do this. Under these strategies, there are even more ways to do it. But these are just simple, I simplified it for you so you know where to start, especially for students with that big vocabulary gap. Okay, because in the end, we want to give Filipino children a chance to understand and, of course, be understood. And we're all doing this as a parent, as a teacher, para sa mga bata. Yan. And with that, I want to show you references. Yan. There are many references online, and maraming salamat. So if you want to follow me on YouTube, I made the channel just last month just to help other teachers who are struggling with online teaching. So these are free resources. I only have 84 subscribers, so huwag kayong mag-alala. Hindi ako kikita dito if you follow me, but I'll be uploading some of my strategies and lessons as well in literacy, specifically as I go along the way. Kasi katulad nyo, nagpe-prepare rin ako para sa pasukan. So with that, thank you so much. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you so much, Sir Mike. Now we'll proceed po with the question and answer po. We have some question here from our viewers. So the first question po, sir, is from Ma'am Flor Estrada. How are we
Hi,
going to
ma'am.
encourage learners to read if they themselves don't like to read either, since they prefer to listen than reading?
Yeah, that's a nice question. It all boils down to where I started. Most of the time, you have to address that. So what I want to do, lalo na for earlier grades pa lang, but even in high school or the upper grades, you want to address that. Why do you not want to read? Okay, bakit ayaw nila magbasa? And you can ask them on parang one-on-one basis, no? Sometimes kasi the kids would already tell you. Kasi teacher, hindi po ako magaling, mali po yung accent ko. Minsan accent, again, yung Filipinos kasi we focus too much on that accent, okay, the pronunciation. We sometimes sacrifice the vocabulary itself and the comprehension. So you can ask that. Second, even if they're not interested, make sure to expose them. So what I do, lalo na a book to them, get a book. Ay, sorry. Something with words. Kunyari, nagbasa ako ng libro. Kailangan sanayin mo sila na hindi mo lagi pinapakita lahat ng pictures, for instance. Tapos may mga papapakita ka lang para hindi rin sila maging dependent too much on the picture. But after that, when you put the book down, we want that book to be available for them to look at. So even if they're not gonna read it yet or they're not really reading it yet, magkakaroon sila ng gana to go and approach that book kasi lagi nagbabasa si teacher. So that's one way. Okay? So another one, the first one I said is ask bakit ganun yung nafe-feel niya o bakit ayaw niya minsan mag-English or bakit ayaw niya magbasa. Then you can also keep exposing them to literary language experiences, especially with books. And lastly, a third one is make sure nakikita rin nila si teacher na nagbabasa. So ang strategy ko, kasi 'di ba lalo na face to face to, 'di ba? Maaga talaga ako pumapasok. Nagbabantay ako ng homeroom or ng classroom, tapos nagbabasa ako ng libro habang nandun sila. Kahit naglalaro sila, they know that an adult is reading. Because remember, especially for struggling families or low-income families, hindi naman lahat ng bata maraming libro sa bahay. So as teachers, you want to provide them with a lot of books, a print-rich environment. Sana po nasagot ko yun. Thanks, ma'am.
Thank you so much, sir. Next question po from Ma'am Maria Ledesma. Which is more effective po in improving vocabulary of our learners? Is it through reading or listening activities?
Okay. Okay, I think I understand where this is coming from, but that's why I showed you the domains of literacy. There are two basic schools of thought. You have your structured approach and you have your balanced approach. Sa structured approach kasi, nagsisimula talaga kagad sila sa decoding. Like, usually the Montessori approach is very structured. But for the balanced approach, both are equally effective as long as you know how to use them. For the balanced approach, even if you're looking at vocabulary, it doesn't mean na you don't go through listening and to reading. Dapat pareho yun. So balanced approach, meron kang reading, meron kang listening, meron kang oral communication, may writing ka. So lahat yun nakatahi sa buong lesson mo throughout the term or throughout the year. So I cannot really answer that as pipili lang ako kung listening or reading. Dapat pareho yun. Pareho yun. But because we're talking about vocabulary deficit, then you should give a little bit of priority dun sa word strategies kung paano sila mag-a-approach or a-atake sa isang unfamiliar word. So again, both po yan importante. Next,
Thank
ma'am.
you so much po, Sir Mike. Next question po from Ma'am Elvira Encela Homo. Is giving spelling as an activity helpful to our students before reading text?
Okay. Thanks, ma'am. Thanks, ma'am. Uh, okay. Spelling list, if you noticed earlier, it's part of the word list. Pwede rin kasi siyang part of concept sorts, lalo na if you're asking them to sort it based on suffixes or prefixes. So, spelling lists, ideally, is a separate activity before a text. Kasi pag spelling list, you want them to analyze and to see similarities. Di ba pag nagsa-spelling list ka, most of the time, may similarities sa kanila, may patterns. Kasi kapag halo-halo lang yung pinapaspell mo sa kanila, walang organization. Remember, one way to address the vocabulary gap is to address the confusion. So you want children to organize. So I would say that spelling list, it's better to do it separately from a reading of a book or a storytelling. Mas maganda, mag-introduce ka lang ng target words. So it's not necessarily spelling. So you're focusing on the use, like with definition, hopefully you do say the definition, you say examples, pero they write it down first and then check nyo kung tama. So pwede naman, but ang priority natin is for storytelling context, they need words to use in the book or in the text. Yung spelling list, mas okay siya kapag word attack na talaga yung ina-address mo. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Our last question po, sir, from Ma'am Lisa Espiritu.
Hi, Ma'am
Sir,
Lisa.
how can we do remediation now that we are in distance or remote learning?
Right. So again, I'm like what I said earlier, I'm a reading teacher. I'm not a reading interventionist or a reading specialist. But as reading teachers, guys, hindi naman laging available yung reading specialist and reading interventionist. For vocabulary deficit specifically, kasi yun yung topic natin, again, you have to be able to plan. You have to plan the progress. Okay, so you have to identify ano yung age nung tinuturuan mo. And you have to also look at ano na ba dapat yung mga words. Di ba may sa Department of Education, you can check in their website, there's a list of words that they should already know by that age. So that's a start. Okay, but if you're in a private school, mas marami kayong resources, di ba? So look at that and then you check. Okay, so you do assessment as well. I can't discuss it in detail right now because of the platform and it's also ano rin, no, mahabang usapin yan. But simply put, you have to plan it. So ano yung progress? Nasaan na yung bata at saan mo siya gusto dalhin? Okay? And ako personally, specifically for vocabulary development, this is one of the most, parang, I'm not say it's easy but sa online, mas madaling magturo ng vocabulary based on my experiences the past month kaysa pag magtuturo ako ng, kunyari, attitude towards learning or, attitude towards literature or magtuturo ako ng talagang reading comprehension kasi hindi ko nakikita yung bata, di ba? Ang layo, ang hirap. So there are ways to do it. Kaya lang, yung problem lang sa vocabulary deficit when you want to remediate, ang hirap mag-correct ng instantaneously, especially pag hindi mo nakikita. That's why, yun, if you're going to read, screen sharing is very important, feedback is very important, whatever platform you're using, dapat nakikita nyo at instantaneous rin yung pag-comment nyo doon. Okay? So sorry, hindi ko po masagot yan in detail. But for now, you have to start with a plan. So meaning, look at vocabulary, look at listening comprehension, look at reading comprehension. So balikan nyo na lang po yung kanina, yung 5 essential components of reading. That's a good start.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering the
Thank you.
questions of our viewers. Do you have any last reminders po for our viewers this afternoon?
Okay, well, again, thank you so much for having me, Miss Michelle, and to Vibal. Again, this is tough times. These are tough times, and reading is just one of the different subjects that we have to teach, especially if you're still transitioning or magsa-start pa lang yung classes. For vocabulary deficit, I just want you to remember you cannot disregard or you cannot ignore that it's a societal gap. You have to be able to address that bago ka pa mag-start. You have to, meaning, hindi mo naman pag-uusapan yung, ekonomiya, yung paghihirap, pero you have to remove those images na pangmayaman na ng English, ang jologs ng Filipino, mother tongue is not a nice language. Okay? And then when we hear people talk in a different accent, we don't make fun of those people. We understand. Okay? And when we start with that, start with that mindset, a strong mindset, something that focuses on empathy and connecting to other people, then you go and start your remediation using the strategies that I gave. And it might just change it more, the flow of it. So sana po nakatulong and all the best sa ating lahat. Nakita tayo next year at maitawid natin itong online learning. Maraming salamat po.
There we have it. In behalf of Vibal Group Incorporated, I would like to thank you, Sir Mike, for being with us today, for giving us insightful and comprehensive learning session. It is our pleasure and an honor to have you with us this afternoon. And to all our Kabibal viewers, all thanks to you for your continuous patronage to our daily learning session. As always, thank you so much at magandang araw po sa ating lahat. Goodbye po!